So Bellfield Farm, basically back in, 2008, we began a whole series of excavation works across the area, which is just up north of the Bewley Firth. This was in advance of a big kind of housing development, which I think is now built, as far as I understand. So we did about 5 phases of work. The last phase was a small watching brief back in 2017. The site is a veritable smorgasbord of archaeology. There is literally everything from the Neolithic through to the early historic period. So I'm going to take you through some of the key aspects of the site quite quickly, and then we'll get to some of the more interesting stuff about the bronze craft work that's taking place on the site during the later Bronze Age. So area 1, you can see we've got a couple of little roundhouses. So you've got this quite big complex roundhouse up here. You've got another little roundhouse here, and then what looks to be like some sort of iron workshop and a little midden down there. In area 2A, we've got some more roundhouses. And then over in area 2B, you've got even more roundhouses and some little 4-post structures. And then in area 3, we had this palisaded enclosure over here. And then during the watching brief in 2017, we had quite a lot of pits and then just another little roundhouse hidden down at the corner. So you can see already that it's quite a busy area and that there's a lot of things happening. In terms of the actual chronology, the earliest phases we have date to the early to middle Neolithic, and these are really sort of centered on a couple of pits in area 1 and some in area 2. So you've got this little pit cluster here where we had quite a lot of finds coming out from that. We had various flint tools. We also had a lot of pottery, which is this impressware style. Okay. We also had one radiocarbon date come from that, which dates it really to kind of that middle Neolithic period. We don't seem to have any evidence for activity during the late Neolithic. It seems to be pretty much empty at that point. So what we might be looking at is kind of very early sort of transient activity, potentially they're coming down to the coast for fishing and other activities. During the early Bronze Age as well, the site appears to be fairly quiet. We have a couple of residual shards of beaker pottery from area 1, but that's about it. So it looks like people are sort of coming and going during this period of time. With regards to the later prehistoric period, it gets a little bit busier and a little bit more interesting. As you've seen, there's a lot of roundhouses, but we do encounter a lot of problems in terms of phasing this period. This is partly due to the fact that the Iron Age is notorious for not having particularly diagnostic artifacts. The only really diagnostic stuff we have relates to the bronze working evidence, which we'll come back onto later. A lot of the deposits as well are quite mixed, that a lot of the roundhouses seem to be occupied for lengthy periods of time. We've got evidence for multiple repairs. There are also issues with the radiocarbon dates that the resolution of these is affected by something called the Hallstatt Plateau, which is not a ski resort. What it tends to do is the Hallstatt Plateau tends to make, there's a flat point in the curve, which tends to make all the dates bunch up. So generally, most of the later prehistoric phase we can only say is broadly Iron Age at the moment. We are trying to pin that down as best as possible. You've kind of got an initial late Bronze Age to early Iron Age phase, which that's where the numerous kind of mold fragments we've had have come from. So it seems at this point that the site is largely kind of being employed as some sort of metalworking site. In terms of other associated domestic structures, we don't seem to be able to pin down any of the roundhouses to this phase. But as I said, given the multiple phases of repairs that the houses are kind of going through, it is possible there are some late Bronze Age roundhouses hidden in the site. The early to late Iron Age, we've got multiple roundhouses and those sort of classic 4-poster structures, which are often seen as kind of grain stores or kind of serving some other little ancillary function. So we seem to have kind of a dispersed linear settlement. The fact that a lot of the roundhouses don't intercut suggests they are perhaps broadly contemporary with each other. We do also then have evidence for ironworking. There's a lot of iron slag and there's some evidence for furnaces on the site. So again, the site kind of as having an industrial kind of aspect to it seems to be something that persists from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age. One really important point about the site is where it is, and that it is pretty much the only Iron Age site we have for this region, that within the Black Isle, the number of sites for this period is minimal. We do have comparative sites like Kimbeachy for the Neolithic, but in terms of the Iron Age, we do not have a lot. That a lot of it seems to come from around Inverness, like Culduthel, which Candy spoke about the other day. And then kind of out into Nairn, you've got a lot of other little sites. So again, there's a lot of this kind of one of the other reasons why this site is quite important is it provides a really useful insight into the Iron Age of the Black Isle. We then seem to have this kind of early historic period, which is really centered around a number of kind of drying ovens. So a lot of this seems to relate to agricultural activities that are taking place across the site. So those are kind of usually dating to about sort of 700 to about 900 AD. So they're coming quite a lot later. So in terms of today, obviously we could talk about the entire site if we wanted to in detail, but we'd probably be here until next week. So we're going to avoid that. Instead, what we'll do is we'll talk about Structure 8, this rather unassuming little building, which is that one there. That this and this series of pits seem to be the primary area where the bronze working is taking place during the late Bronze Age to the early Iron Age. Structure 8 is basically, you could say it is a little Bronze Age shed of some description. That it's a fairly small building, it's about 1.9 meters long. So it's either a building of some sort or a windbreak. From two of the post holes, we do have those kind of ceramic mold fragments, which are used for bronze casting. And this is part of the reason why we're linking and associating those with the pits just to the south. These pits just down here, because this is where all the mold fragments seem to have come from. So it sort of suggests that Structure 8 is probably associated with the bronze working, that maybe it's like a little windbreak where they're casting, or it is some sort of like shed-like building where, you know, activities like polishing or other crafting activities are taking place. In terms of the pits, which are all the way down here, there's a variety of different pits that we seem to have. They're broadly kind of U-shaped, some are quite deep. It is possible that some of these are actual casting pits themselves and are connected to the actual bronze working process. There are similar pits from a site called Burney, which we'll discuss later. So there seems to be a mixture of potential casting pits and waste pits sort of happening. And we'll kind of talk a little bit more about these later on. We do have one radiocarbon date from one of these, which is about 800 to 540 Cal BC, which, given the types of metalworking, the styles of axes and things that are being produced, that date fits really nicely for that phase of metalworking. In terms of bronze working, it's just a very brief overview for people who may not be familiar. I also quite like the fact that Bob Ross seems to be involved in the process. So initially, you're smelting your raw material. So that's your copper tin mixture. Usually it's about 15% tin to make bronze. During this process, that's being melted down into crucibles made of clay. The interesting thing about bronze working, and this is part of the reason why we're perhaps not finding specific structures or furnaces associated, is the temperatures required for bronze working are not particularly high. So instead, they may be using things like temporary hearths or casting pits, which again is what some of the pits close to Structure 8 may be doing. You're then looking at the preparation and sealing of the molds. So the molds themselves are made of clay. We'll have a look at those in a bit more detail later on. Those molds are then basically sealed, either using some organic material like twine, or they're wrapped in a layer of clay. The liquid metal is then obviously poured into that mold using a pouring cup. The metal then obviously sets, cools, you break open the mold, and then you're looking at your last stages, which involve the polishing and hafting. So we have evidence on site for all of these stages that we are not just getting the molds, but we are getting fragments of crucibles and fragments of the pouring cups. So again, it does suggest that they are actively smelting and producing the bronze or melting down bronze on site. We have about 6 fragments of crucibles, and those do have various metal residues adhering to them. We have done some limited analysis of that, which is in the table that you can see. So we are getting copper, which you'd expect, and we are getting tin, which you would expect. So there is definitely bronze there, but those metal signatures are also mixed in with various other things like iron. You've got some zinc and other things going on. These kind of mixed signals may also kind of reflect on the sources of the bronze, that during this period, what they may be doing is bringing in damaged or broken bronze tools and melting those down and recasting them. There is evidence for scrap items in the Doris assemblage from Inverness. So we are seeing kind of items and potentially some hoards, like some of the items in the Pool hoard, are damaged and broken. So it has been suggested that some hoards could be kind of like blacksmiths burying material that they're going to come back to later on and repurpose for metalworking. You also potentially get it being imported as ingots, which is this rather unattractive lump here from Rothshire. So obviously for all this material to get there, the site is clearly having to be engaged in quite broad networks of import and export, that things are having to be brought to the site. So it clearly is not a remote location. It is clearly connected to much broader networks, and we'll come back to those later on. In terms of the actual molds, the molds are made using local clays, and this was actually examined as part of the Feats of Clay project, which was a community project that was done on the side of this. And quite a lot of this information is actually taken from that project, and I will advise you to go and look at that later on. So we are getting clay molds, but you do get examples of stone molds as well. So the choice of using clay suggests that these are designed as kind of one and done molds. They are only for single use, that once they've been cast, they're just broken open, and then they are clearly just being deposited into a pit. The fact they're relatively unabraded suggests they've not just been lying around, but they have been dumped pretty quickly into the waste pits. In terms of how they're being kind of sealed or wrapped when they're being cast, it appears they're actually coating them in an additional layer of clay. So they're not using organic material, but they're actually just putting another kind of almost a pillowcase of clay around that. We've got about 192 of these mold fragments, which is one of, if not the largest collection in the UK as a whole. So that's a big kind of selling point for this site, is the actual quantity of material from this site is unparalleled. And about 69 of these molds are actually identifiable, so we can actually define and tell what a lot of these items are. In terms of the actual items we have got quite an interesting range. And a lot of these seem to be kind of agricultural, also woodworking tools, so things like sickles. Again, those will be for kind of anything like harvesting grain, stuff like that. Your socketed gouges are basically like little chisels. But it is curious that we aren't getting a lot of kind of examples of the kind of classic weaponry, that things like spearheads. Swords are absent, but we know that swords are being produced in the local region, that down at Seafield West near Inverness, they are making swords. So it sort of suggests that there's kind of the focus of the production here is very much centered on agricultural tools and equipment. At the bottom, you can see here, this is kind of basically what the molds look like when they come out. Some are a little bit more recognizable than others. So it does take quite a keen eye to tell what these are. The sickles are incredibly important. That actual finds of sickles themselves, the actual finished articles, are incredibly rare. They do not turn up often. The actual molds, Bellfield Farm is the only place that we know of that has these molds. And this is one up here. And you can see how closely that this matches the actual finished article itself. that this midrib that you're getting here is very pronounced in the mold, and you can see it on the item itself. So for that reason alone, in a sense, Bellfield is incredibly important because we've never seen this before, and all 4 of these sickle molds were recovered from the same pit, which could imply that all the sickles were produced basically in one go. The socketed axes, we've got about 4 or 5 of these, and they're a very classic type called a Sompting type axe, which belongs to that Llynfawr stage of bronze metalworking, which again, that overlaps very nicely with that one radiocarbon date that we have. You get Sompting axes from various hordes across the Highlands. There's a good number of examples from up at Pool U. This stereotype mold from Sutherland, you can see very clearly, the outline of the axe here, and that is partly reflected in this example here from Bellfield. You can see the edge and the base of the axe coming across here. All of these molds are designed to basically in 2 pieces. They're called bivalve molds. So they're just a sandwich. There's 2 layers of clay, and then you pour the bronze into the center of that. We've got gouges and knives, and we've got some really nice examples of these. This is one of these examples of a gouge, and you can see at the top where the valve is, basically for the bronze to be poured in, comes down, settles here. You've also got these little sort of tenon and mortise joints, which basically hold the 2 bits of the mold together. Spearheads. Spearheads, we've got quite a lot of fragments of spearheads, and again, they're not especially diagnostic, but they do all appear to be from one single spearhead, which is this sort of socketed spearhead, which there's a nice example here. You can just sort of make out part of the edge of the spearhead in this, and this bit up here is part from around the socket of the spearhead. In terms of its wider context, Bellfield obviously isn't the only workshop that we have for this period. We do, as I mentioned earlier, have the examples from Seafield West near Inverness, where there were a number of sword mould fragments recovered. We also have sites like Burney, where there was evidence for bronze casting. There's Trapbrain Law as well, where we have a lot of evidence for metalworking there. I think it's worth, we'll just have a quick look at 2 of these. We're going to have a look at Burney, and then we'll nip off to Shetland for a little bit. Just to kind of, again, get a flavour of the wider context of the site. So Burney is very similar to Bellfield in the sense that we are seeing quite a complex site, that again, there are multiple phases of occupation to that. There's quite an extensive Iron Age settlement there as well. The context in which the metalworking debris is being found, which includes things like crucibles and mould fragments, is very similar to Bellfield. So again, we might be looking at kind of 2 very similar sites with little bronze workshops. And again, they are possibly kind of broadly contemporary with each other. At Burney, they do appear to be kind of producing slightly different things, that they seem to be producing things like bangles and pins. You've also got socketed axes and spearheads and possible sword. So again, this may suggest that some sites are producing different things. There may be different specialist smiths that are working in different areas, producing different products. And we'll kind of come back and discuss kind of some of those ideas and some of those models in a little bit. All the way up in Jarlshof, you've got some bronze working that appears to be associated with some of the later buildings, although the stratigraphy at Jarlshof is a little bit bananas in places, so it's not entirely clear when and where some of this is taking place. As at sort of Seafield, as at Burney, and as at Bellfield, you've got your fragments of crucibles, you've got some really nice kind of axe molds, and there's obviously some bits of swords. You've also got pins and gouges that are being produced. For Jarlshof, the interpretation for that material is being that it was produced by an itinerant smith who came up from Ireland, produced some stuff in Shetland, and then presumably wandered off again. And this is kind of one of the really kind of critical arguments about bronze working during this period, is how is it organized? are we looking at specific permanent industries that are being set up in places, or are we looking at a smith who will come into an area, work on a specific number of products, and then move on again? The way to kind of start to unpick that is maybe to look at the nature of the structures and the nature of the things associated. With Bellfield and Burnley, there does seem to be kind of quite a scale to the work. So whether it's a permanent kind of workshop or a very short and intensive phase of metalworking that we've got at Bellfield, we're not entirely clear. The fact that all of the recorded types of metalwork are broadly contemporary does support the idea that this could be a very short-lived but intensive phase of activity. It is also interesting, as I say, that we've got a very clear focus on tools. So again, we're looking at agricultural tools, carpentry tools. The evidence for kind of weapons, things like swords, halberds, spears, is quite minimal, but it is always possible that within the multiple fragments we've not been able to recognise that there are examples of these kicking about. So we can't rule that out entirely. It's also interesting that we do have evidence for ironworking on the site. So there does seem to be this idea that they are transitioning from bronze working into ironworking. And we've already seen quite large-scale ironworking down at Culduthel, just to the south. So we can kind of contextualise the changes at Bellfield within those kind of broader kind of shifts from bronze to iron during that late Bronze Age to early Iron Age period. In terms of where the project is up to, we are aiming, I say we are aiming to, it's dependent on everything else, to have the final kind of draft of this ready by the end of this year, maybe early next year. The article is hopefully going to be published through SER, so that'll be through the Scottish Archaeology Internet Reports. So that will hopefully make it accessible to everyone. I would say that in the meantime, if anyone wants a good overview of the interim results, to have a look at the Feats of Clay volume. That has a really nice overview of the site and an overview of the broader context of the site and kind of examples of bronze metalworking from across that area. And that is everything I have to say on that.